Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I wanted to talk about dissociation and its link to enmeshment trauma. So let's get started. So first of all, dissociation, I consider it to be a survival strategy. It is definitely a trauma response to the developmental trauma of enmeshment. If you experienced enmeshment in your family system, you absolutely experienced a type of developmental trauma. There was a deficit in your developmental needs being met, and therefore you were not able to develop to the full capacity that you were supposed to develop, very specifically emotionally. And so, what happens when we have a developmental deficit as a result of a developmental trauma? We experience trauma responses because we have to learn how to cope with that environment and survive that environment as best as possible. So, dissociation is one of the ways that we cope with an enmeshed family system environment. So, enmeshment trauma overwhelms a child's nervous system, okay? Parents are putting more on their children emotionally than those children are actually developmentally capable of. So, when we experience enmeshment trauma, we experience an environment where there are unclear emotional boundaries between parents and their children. That bond, there is a role reversal, an emotional role reversal in the parent-child dynamic. The child ends up having to, one, be emotionally responsible for themselves, which they're not capable of. They are supposed to be taken care of emotionally and getting their emotional needs met and their developmental needs met. Childhood is a time that you're supposed to be being held in an environment where you get to learn about who you are, sense yourself, feel the fullness of your emotions, and learn how to cope with those emotions and deal with those emotions. If there are unclear boundaries between parents and children end up having to be emotionally responsible for themselves, and then on top of that, responsible for their parents' emotions, they're going to be incredibly overwhelmed because they don't know how to deal with emotions. That's the point of childhood, is to learn how to deal with their own emotions, not to handle the emotional problems and process the emotional experience of their caregivers. That is absolutely a violation of the purpose of parenting. So when children are feeling emotionally overwhelmed and chronically dysregulated, they're going to develop a trauma response in order to deal with that. And dissociation is one of those trauma responses. So they learn to dissociate by disconnecting from their body and neglecting their emotional experience. So they will grow to learn to repress those emotions and essentially dissociate from their own bodies. That's because the emotional experience, that discomfort that I'm talking about that becomes overwhelming, is actually happening in the body, in the nervous system. Our emotions, they happen inside of our body, right? It is a nervous system activation anytime we're experiencing an emotion. So that dissociation from the body is really, really helpful in the case of overwhelm. So it's kind of like a shutdown response or a numbing response, right? So, this coping mechanism essentially of dissociation, this survival strategy of dissociation, it's used to numb those overwhelming emotions, to distract from those overwhelming emotions, or to deflect those overwhelming emotions. Okay? Now, it is an incredibly adaptive response in childhood because you are overwhelmed. So, dissociation makes sense. But the problem is it becomes a learned response, a repetitive behavior that then is operating sort of by default. Okay. And that child will go on to carry that same coping mechanism into later life, into their adulthood. And it becomes maladaptive at that point because they're no longer in the family environment. And now they're having to deal with the challenges of real life and adulthood, such as having to learn to regulate themselves and take care of their bodies on a day-to-day basis, such as having to work, such as having to learn to have different types of relationships, intimate relationships, friendships, work relationships. Professional life is necessary, home intimate life is necessary, parenting is necessary. And this dissociation, if you're always using dissociation to deal with these different challenging and demanding parts of life, obviously there's going to be dysfunction in those parts of life, because you need to be emotionally present and you need access to your emotions and the information that your body is giving you in order to be able to navigate the interactions of everyday life and make good decisions, right? And to also cope with inevitable life challenges, things like facing death. If you face the death of a loved one and you're dissociated, you're not going to experience the grief fully, and that's going to create all sorts of complications in the long term. Things like, actual physical illness from the internalization of that experience, and also a disconnection in the relationship. You're not going to be able to relate authentically and deeply to people if you can't actually be deeply connected to the way that you feel about them and the way that you feel about losing them. So dissociation is actually an adaptive coping mechanism, because when you're a child, you can't deal with that overwhelm, that sense of overwhelm. But it's maladaptive in adult life when you do have the tools and resources in order to be able to learn how to deal with your emotions and emotionally regulate in a better way, so that you can be more emotionally present in your everyday life. Okay? So, some of the ways that we dissociate, and I'm just naming some. The more I study this, the more I realize that there are thousands of different ways we dissociate on a daily basis. But some of the ways we dissociate are through actual distraction. So, distracting our attention away from the stimulus, away from the thing that is generating the emotion towards some other thing. For example, doom scrolling, watching TV, it can be things like an external source of regulation, such as using substances, for example, and therefore eventually developing addictions as a form of self-regulating, numbing the pain that we are not dealing with directly, because we don't yet know how to deal with that emotional pain, because again, our coping mechanism was dissociating from it in childhood versus learning how to deal with it by being supported and taught by our caregivers how to do so. Okay. Other ways that we may learn to deal with that can be through compulsions, like an eating disorder or an eating compulsion. It can be like a relationship compulsion. That's something that I haven't yet talked about on my channel, but I'm going to go much deeper into that, because one of the main ways that we use to cope with our emotions is actually codependency. Codependency is a way of not dealing directly with the internalized pain that we have. Being addicted to relationships, jumping from relationship to relationship, seeking others as a source of validation, as a source of external regulation. Not to say that co-regulation isn't a totally valid, coping mechanism. It absolutely is. I'm a huge, huge fan. But it needs to be balanced with other sources of healthy, emotional regulation and emotional processing skills. Okay, so this is again going to lead to issues in adult life, addictions, compulsions, intimacy issues, professional issues. Okay. And mental and emotional health issues as well. I didn't mention that one. Mental, emotional, and physical health issues. It can manifest as, depression. It can manifest as an anxiety disorder, or if you already have anxiety and depression from another root cause, it can exacerbate that, right? It can contribute to the symptoms being much more intense and much more frequent. It can lead to physical health disorders, chronic stress, right? If you're dissociating constantly from your body, you're in a chronic state of dysregulation. And so this is going to cause psychosomatic issues or exacerbate psychosomatic issues and physical conditions that are associated with those psychosomatic issues. So again, the dissociation becomes incredibly maladaptive in later life. And now it's a learned and an ingrained behavior. So we have to begin to heal from it. When we're learning to heal from enmeshment, we have to heal the dissociation, the disconnection from the core self, from the emotional self, from the body, from the nervous system. Now, think of it like you've been freezing yourself your entire life. You've been freezing out your emotions. If you just, set fire to it all at once, it's going to be incredibly overwhelming. So I do not recommend that route. I know there are people who go that route and who sort of just throw themselves into the chaos right away, and deal with it all at once. I do not recommend that route. It is an incredible amount of emotional pain all at once. So I do recommend a very, very cautious process of learning to slowly warm up your body to feeling yourself again, to sensing yourself, to developing a sense of self little by little. Okay. Um, First and foremost, the first step of that is to slowly begin to notice the different ways that you are dissociating and the different defense mechanisms and coping mechanisms that you use to dissociate. So think about all the ways that your body and your mind on a day-to-day basis protect you from actually feeling your feelings. Okay, this could be, again, the ways that you distract yourself. You turn your attention away from the thing that you're feeling. This could be the way that you intellectualize. I know for me, that's been a huge one my whole life. One of the ways that I've dissociated from my body is from being hyper intellectual. I don't know if that shows through here on my channel, but that's definitely one of the ways that I dissociate. So sometimes healing, like it's important to learn about healing and to learn the theory and to, cognitively understand what's going on. But that can end up being a way that we defend ourselves from the actual difficult part of the process of walking the path and, reconnecting with the emotional body and feeling our feelings and feeling through the hard stuff, because that's where the real healing is. It's not necessarily thinking our way through. Thinking helps us. It's kind of like the map, but the actual journey, you have to walk the path, like through the dark, muggy forest. So intellectualization can be one of the ways that one of the defense mechanisms that we use to stop ourselves from feeling. And other, again, like I mentioned already, it could be like substance uses, it could be, using food, it could be using relationships, it could be using work, it could be using all kinds of different processes and activities in order to defend ourselves from actually just getting down to the grimy hard stuff of sitting with our emotional pain and befriending our emotional pain and the really uncomfortable sensations that brings up in the body. So it's a very body oriented process. It's very somatic. Okay. So I do recommend learning somatic practices if it's available and accessible to you. There are all sorts of resources here on YouTube to start your process of learning how to get back in touch with your body and, using somatic practices and somatic skills. And learning emotional self-containment and emotional regulation. So emotional self-containment, again, is that ability to create a safe space or a safe structure within yourself to feel your pain, to hold space for your own pain, the way a loving parent or a really good therapist or a really empathetic friend would hold space for your pain. Can you become that container and that friend for yourself? Literally give yourself a big hug and hold all of that emotion that's coming up for you. Okay. And self-regulation. Self-regulation is the ability to regulate your state. So change your state. The containment process is, I talk about it as sort of like an acceptance. It's a lot about acceptance and embracing. Okay, I'm sad and I'm just going to hold space for this sadness right now, right? Regulation is about actually doing what you need to do in order to move yourself out of that state. Okay, I'm stressed right now. And instead of holding space for the stress, what I want to do is regulate myself out of this stress. Both of them are incredibly valuable. You will need a little bit of both. I think self-containment is super important because the more we can learn to sit with our pain for a little bit longer, the more we actually have access to more information in our bodies about what that emotion is trying to tell us. If we automatically self-regulate out of any uncomfortable emotion, we might not be sitting with ourselves long enough to draw wisdom from that experience and to actually make our emotional capacity bigger. The longer we can sit with an emotion and be present with it and hold loving space for it, the more emotional capacity we're going to have in our lives, the more deeply we're going to be able to feel, the more deeply we're going to be able to relate to others and relate to ourselves. So it creates a more like a bigger uh, a more full experience of life. And then self-regulation is also necessary because we do need to know how to move ourselves out of certain states so that we can get things done in our lives, right? If we're just kind of like sitting all day in sadness, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, we're never going to do the other parts of life that are probably important to us or necessary to us. Okay. Now, I talk about two different processes um, in the healing process. The first is self-healing, which are essentially, I consider practices that you do with yourself. So things like sitting in meditation, um, sitting in like a body scan, doing some type of self-body work, journaling, being in nature, taking walks in nature and just being present with yourself and whatever you're feeling in nature. Sitting by the water helps a lot. I think being by those of you who are lucky enough and privileged enough to sit by the ocean, anytime you're experiencing a very strong emotion, instead of dissociating out of it, go sit by the ocean for 20 minutes and just be present with what you're feeling and notice how much that helps and improves your situation. Okay. How much more space you have for that emotion, how much you transmute that emotion, how the quality of that emotion changes. Okay. I also talk about creating a feeling sanctuary. I know this has been very important for me. I'm in my feeling sanctuary right now. It's a room in my house that I have created just for therapeutic processes. So I do therapy in here. I make videos for you all in here, and I feel myself in here. I come in here when I'm experiencing a very strong emotion and needing to process things. And it's a very quiet space. It's got warm lighting. It's beautiful and it's safe. It's got a beautiful window that uh, sees the nature outside of my house. So it is a feeling sanctuary. I come here and it becomes a sanctuary for me to feel in. It's a safe, contained space for me to process what's going on inside of me. So find whatever that looks like for you. What is your feeling sanctuary? What do you need to create in your environment? Maybe it's a place you go, like the middle of the forest or something, where you can just learn to feel through the things that are coming up inside of you and start to give your body space again to feel and to experience itself and warm up slowly instead of like, heat the fire all at once and then totally burn yourself out. And then relational healing is very, very important. So I want you all to consider also what it might look like in your life to begin integrating more relational spaces that feel safe for you to start feeling yourself again. If you have access to it, a really good therapeutic relationship with someone that you trust and is doing good trauma work and is trauma informed, um, support groups, group healing experiences, such as joining healing retreats or things like that. Those of you who are involved in these types of experiences know what I'm talking about, but it could be something as simple as like a men's retreat that you go for a weekend, or involving yourself in a community that does regular therapeutic healing experiences for people who have suffered from trauma. And then I think, building community. So finding 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 really good friends, and I think I would call this soul friends or healing friendships, people that can hold space for you, who can listen in deeply and who are empathetic and who are there to help you with your healing process and your healing journey, and are really present with you so that you can learn to feel in a safe container of a relationship. Okay. So remember, dissociation is a lot about the body. We're disconnecting from the body because the body is where we feel uncomfortable things. So dissociation, healing from dissociation, is about coming back into the body, reconnecting with the body, understanding the ways that we have uh, learned to defend ourselves from being inside of our body and feeling what's actually going on inside of our body, the different ways we've learned to cope with the emotions that we are repressing, the different ways we've learned to self-regulate and self-medicate, and then starting to chip away at some of the defenses and slowly learning to get good at feeling again, feeling your body, feeling your nervous system, feeling your emotions, and experiencing yourself. So I'll tell you the story of a client, a really wonderful client that I work with. She's so amazing, and I learned so much from her. And she was an addict for a very, very long time in her life. She experienced a lot of suffering as a result of her addiction. And we started working together, and she had been through recovery for many, many years, probably over the course more than a decade. And when we started working together, she had already been clean for many years. And she's very, very high functioning. We're doing beautiful work together around other life stuff like relationship issues. And I brought up to her once, that I admired her journey a lot. She'd been clean for so many years, and she had told me, she's like, I don't think I'll ever, like, I'm never going to go back to using. Like, that's just never going to happen. And I asked her, I was like, what makes you feel so certain of that, and what is it that you think got you to this point, like, of so much healing after being so deep down dark in the hole? And she told me, she's like, I just got really good at feeling again. She's like, I want to feel all my emotions. She's just like, during that time, what I was trying to do was not feel. And now that I learned how to feel through therapy, through recovery programs, through all that, learning how to feel, I realized I just want to feel everything. I want to feel all of life, the good and the bad. I don't want to run from any of that anymore. But first, I had to get really good at feeling. I had to learn how to feel in a safe way. So, and this is so beautiful. I'm getting chills just saying it, because that's what it's about. Get really good at feeling. And if you get really good at feeling, guys, I promise you, your healing will happen naturally as a result of that. Okay? Thank you all for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.